Alright, so we're back and we're talking about biogeography. We were talking about dispersal, how species expand their ranges or their habitats. So what would be some barriers? And a couple different ones. There's biogeographic barriers or corridors. So a corridor connects different habitats. So think of it like a natural highway, right? If I get this to work. Right? Now, imagine on this biogeographic highway, right, this corridor that connects different habitats, there are some kind of filters. So things that might let some animals or plants through, but not others. So let's say that there are two big, huge areas for monarch butterflies. We'll use them as an example. And there's this narrow biogeographic corridor that connects them, that allows movement. But something along that corridor stops them from just the butterflies from moving, but not other plants or animals. So that's a filter. So a filter stops some animals, but it's not a complete hard barrier. And these could be things like predation. Maybe there is an animal that eats the butterflies along the way that doesn't let them get past. Or if they need mutualistic partners like the fish and the anemone, or the hummingbird and the flower, and maybe that one flower doesn't go any farther, that's its limit, right? So those are biological filters as well. Here's an example how dispersal happens on islands like the Hawaiian Islands or off coast. Okay, so first way you can have it is stepping stone. And so that's where you kind of have these islands that are pretty close to each other, maybe right offshore. So basically species or ants or animals move from one island to the next to the next. And there's a filter here. Maybe not every animal can cross this stretch of water. Right, so some plants maybe can only get their seeds blown so far, so that filters out some from moving. Now, sometimes if there's a bigger gap, say island number 1 wasn't here, okay, so that's the initial filter. Waif dispersal happens when if island 1 isn't here, how does something get from the mainland to here? It's a little further out, okay, so that tends to be accidental. Maybe a bird got blown off course, or like we talked about, monkeys got stuck on a tree raft that floated out to the ocean, right? So this is a bigger filter. Fewer animals or plants will make this. And the last one right here, they call this the sweepstakes dispersal. So imagine this is Hawaii and this is Asia. It's about 4,000 miles. So for something to make that jump, that's a pretty big filter. In fact, almost everything very rarely makes it. So in other words, the odds of making this dispersal from here over all this space is like winning the lottery. It's very rare. They call that the sweepstakes or the lottery winning. So Hawaii is a good example. Hawaii has a very unique mixture of plants, native plants and animals. For instance, before Europeans and before humans came, there were no land animals other than birds. So no snakes, no rats, no lizards, just birds. Because birds were the only animals that could get that far. And they evolved to fill many roles. So there were some birds lost their wings, couldn't fly. A very specific set of plants as well. Now, when animals move to a new region, like birds and trees and plants to Hawaii, if they do it naturally with no human help, that's called colonization. Okay, so the red finch that I showed you colonized the Hawaiian Islands. But if people help, then that is an invasion, whether we do it willingly or unwillingly. So people brought over pigs and cows and horses to the New World with the colonial empires. That was on purpose. That was an invasion. But there are unintended invasions. So back in the 1950s, the United States and Canada created the St. Lawrence Seaway. And what this was it allowed ships to sail up the St. Lawrence River from the ocean into the Great Lakes. Before that, there were waterfalls and rapids. If you wanted to go to the Great Lakes, you couldn't sail straight from the ocean. But after 1955, you could. And what happened was boats from the ocean in Europe had water on them that they picked up in Europe in their hold. And they call this bilge water. It's basically water at the bottom of the boat to kind of help it from rolling over. And in this water were tiny little animals, little plants, little animals, and eggs of animals like the zebra mussel, which is a clam, basically. When they got here, and some of that water got out of the boat, the plants and animals in that bilge water got into the Great Lakes, and now we have zebra mussels. They are an invasive species. Totally unintended. Okay? A great example here the book talks about is an animal that's done both, the cattle egret. So this is a bird right here. It lives near cows. As cows eat the grass, it stirs up the bugs, and they eat the bugs. So they live wherever there are cows. They are originally from Africa and Europe. But somehow during a storm, a few of them got blown over and landed right here in South America, naturally. Okay? Now, there is a small amount of cattle ranching here, not that much, but this is where they got naturally. But we have cattle ranching in the United States and in South America, and that allowed them to expand their range. And you can see that now this was an invasion because cows were here because of people. Without the cows, they would never have expanded beyond this one little range. So the use of cows and cattle farming has allowed them to expand today. So now they are invasive species in all these other areas. It's one of the few that has actually met both characteristics. Okay. So now we're going to move on to another thing, talking about environments, and this idea of ecological succession. Okay. So you start off with this idea of ecological disturbance. So an ecosystem, right? That's this whole combination of plants and animals. So let's look at a forest, for instance. You have the trees, you've got the plants on the ground, you have the birds that live in the trees, the insects, you have the moose that live and crawl around, all these different animals, right? Something happens to disrupt it. So in the example of Yellowstone, right, the removal of wolves. So you take out this animal, this predator. Or an abiotic factor. If there's a volcanic eruption that covers the forest in ash, or even a forest fire, that disrupts it as well. Okay? So biotic factors involve other life forms. So invasive species, either natural or anthropogenic. Maybe there's an infestation of ants or crickets or bees. Those are things that happen. Abiotic disturbances are the ones that happen with nature. So a fire or an avalanche or flooding, right? It isn't not basically non-life things. Let's talk about fire. This map shows you the United States and how often are wildfires, how often do they happen? So in other words, the areas in red have a average wildfire between up to about 35 years. So between 0 to 35 years, every 35 years or so there's a fire, a natural fire. Some of these areas have a lot less. You can see that the green areas maybe have a fire once every 200 years compared to this. So the animals that live in this area are used to fires. They depend on fires, in fact, to help them with their life process. Whereas areas in here, because there's so few, right, don't have that whole mix. So what's the adaptation? Well, one of these things, some of these animals, some of these plants, have pine cones. A lot of these are forests, right? And these pine cones are sealed. They actually need the heat of the fire to unseal them and open them up. Because what happens is these trees have evolved that after a fire, when all of the ground cover is burnt away, that's a good time to drop your seed, so there's nothing to stop them from growing. Another thing, especially in the prairies, areas of grasslands, in the summer, the grass may dry due to lack of water, and makes it very susceptible to fire. There's a hot, dry summer, you have a lightning strike, and plants burn down to the ground. You think that would be it, but a lot of the plants in the grasslands have evolved these very long, deep roots that basically are they survive underground until the fire's done, and then they sprout back. In fact, we have messed with this as people with fire suppression. So in some areas of the country, fires happen almost every year. The natural ecosystem has evolved that usually every fall there's a fire, a grass fire or a small forest fire. But people don't like that. We see a fire, we think it's a bad thing, so we stop it. We put out the fires, especially if the wildfires threaten nearby areas where people live. But one of the problems is a lot of these areas that have fires every year, the fire is such a big part of the ecosystem that anything that can burn gets burnt off every year. If there's no fire that year, that dead living trees and grass and branches that would normally burn off every year is left. And every year you add more fuel so that when a fire does happen, it's even worse. Because basically, naturally, without people, you'd burn off all the fuel every year, it'd be a small fire. But if you stop the fire from doing that year after year, when a fire does break out, there's just that much more fuel. So it burns twice as hot, 3-4 times faster, many larger areas. Okay? In fact, if you watch this video about prescribed burns, in a lot of areas that people are kind of managing the natural areas, they will purposely set fire. So I highly recommend going to watch that video. It talks about prescribed burns in the city of Chicago, actually. And that's where we're going to pause for now. So now that we know, we're going to pause with that and come back with what happens after we have that ecological disruption.